Brenda Lawson was 32, living in Dallas, building a life with her own hands after years of having no one to rely on. The day her husband collapsed at work, everything else stopped. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She just ran. At the hospital, she stayed by his bed every single night, barely sleeping, barely eating, holding his hand like it was the only thing keeping him here. She prayed for him, spoke to him, even when he couldn't answer, told herself he would make it through because she couldn't lose him too. Not after everything she had already lost before him. But one evening, after days that blurred together, she stepped out of the room just to breathe. The hallway was quiet, almost empty, and when she came back, the door wasn't fully closed. She slowed down without knowing why, her hand still holding the coffee she had brought for him. And then she heard his voice, not weak, not tired, calm, clear. He was talking to another woman. "I only married her for the money," he said, like it meant nothing. "Once I'm out of here, I'll take everything and walk away." Brenda didn't move. She didn't breathe. Something inside her went completely still, like the world had just shifted under her feet. And in that moment, without saying a word, without stepping inside that room, she stopped being his wife. What she became after that was something he never saw coming. "Before we go any further, tell me what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story is reaching. And if you've ever trusted someone who didn't deserve it, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Because this one is going to hit closer than you think." A few hours earlier, her phone rang while she was alone in the kitchen. Brenda had been reviewing invoices from one of her furniture stores, her attention split between numbers and the quiet hum of the house she had built, piece by piece, over the years, when the sharp sound of her phone cut through everything. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another supplier calling about deliveries. But something about the timing made her pick it up. The voice on the other end was direct, professional, and carried a weight she couldn't immediately place. The caller asked if she was Mrs. Vaughn, and when she confirmed, there was a brief pause before the words came out in a steady tone, explaining that her husband, Eric Vaughn, had collapsed at his office and was being transported to a hospital nearby. For a second, the information didn't register. It sounded distant, like it was meant for someone else. But then, the meaning settled in, heavy and immediate. She asked what had happened, her voice tightening, and was told it appeared to be a serious cardiac event, though he was still alive and receiving emergency care. That was all she needed to hear. Brenda grabbed her keys without thinking about anything else, leaving everything behind, exactly as it was. The drive felt longer than it should have been, traffic stretching endlessly in front of her, every red light dragging time out further, while her mind kept racing through possibilities she didn't want to face. By the time she reached the hospital, her hands were unsteady. Her focus narrowed to a single question that repeated in her head. She moved quickly through the entrance, approaching the front desk with urgency that didn't need explanation, asking for Eric Vaughn by name. The nurse checked the system and pointed her toward a hallway lined with identical doors, giving her a room number and a brief instruction she barely processed before she started moving again. When she reached the door, she stopped. For just a moment, her breath catching as she looked through the small gap into the room. Eric was lying on the bed, his body connected to machines that tracked every movement, every rhythm, every fragile sign that he was still there. His face looked different, drained of the confidence she had always associated with him, replaced by something more vulnerable, something she had never seen before, Cert. Brenda stepped inside slowly, as if any sudden movement might disturb the balance keeping him alive. She moved closer to the bed and reached for his hand, feeling the coolness of his skin against hers, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. He didn't respond, his eyes closed, his breathings supported by the steady sounds of the equipment around him. A doctor entered shortly after, speaking in measured terms about what had happened, explaining that the situation had been critical, but was now stabilized, though the next few days would be important for his recovery. Brenda listened carefully, asking what needed to be done, what he would need, how she could help. And, when the doctor mentioned rest and monitoring, she made her decision without hesitation. She wasn't leaving. From that point on, her place was right there beside him. No matter how long it took, no matter what it required. The days that followed settled into a rhythm she never questioned. Brenda adjusted her entire life around the hospital room, moving through each hour with quiet focus, making sure everything Eric needed was within reach before he even had to ask. She helped him sit up when the nurses came in, made sure he finished his meals, even when he said he wasn't hungry, and stayed close enough to notice the smallest change in his condition. When he was awake, she spoke to him in a steady voice, keeping the conversation simple, avoiding anything that might tire him out, while inside, she carried a constant pressure she refused to show. When he slept, she remained there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, measuring time not by clocks, but by the soft beeping of the machines beside him. Nurses passed through regularly, sometimes reminding her to rest, sometimes offering to stay while she stepped out, but she always declined with a polite shake of her head, choosing to remain exactly where she was. For Brenda, leaving even for a short time felt like stepping away from something fragile that could disappear the moment she turned her back. The longer she stayed, the more automatic her actions became, as if her body had decided this was the only place she was meant to be. In the quiet hours, when the hallway outside slowed down and the noise of the hospital faded into a distant background, her thoughts began to drift in directions she usually kept buried. She remembered what it had been like, years earlier, standing in a different house that never felt like hers, listening to conversations that excluded her, watching decisions being made without her presence ever being considered important. Her older sister had always been the one who mattered, the one who received attention, approval, and opportunity, while Brenda learned early how to exist, without expecting any of it. The distance between them grew until it became permanent, until one day she left without asking anyone to stop her, building something of her own from the ground up, because there was no other option. Eric had entered her life at a time when stability felt new, when having someone choose her without hesitation had seemed like proof that things had finally changed. That belief had shaped everything that followed, influencing choices she didn't question at the time. Back in the hospital room, those memories stayed at the edge of her mind while she focused on the present, keeping her attention on the man lying in front of her, the person she had trusted enough to let into every part of her life. As the days passed, Eric's condition improved gradually, his voice returning in short sentences, his movements becoming less restricted. Each small step forward, reinforcing her determination to stay close and see it through. By the end of the week, the tension that had defined those first hours had eased slightly, replaced by cautious optimism that things were moving in the right direction. One evening, after spending the entire day without stepping outside, Brenda felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her body in a way she couldn't ignore. She stood up slowly, adjusting the blanket around him before moving toward the door, Sigzem, telling herself she would only be gone for a minute. The hallway felt cooler than the room, the air different enough to make her pause for a second, as she tried to reset her thoughts, unaware that the next moment would change the direction of everything she believed about the life she had built. That evening, the hallway felt unusually quiet. Brenda walked back at a steady pace, her steps slower than before, the cup in her hand still warm as she approached the room. The door was not fully closed, just slightly open, enough for light to spill into the corridor in a thin line across the floor. She didn't think much of it at first, but as she got closer, something about the sound inside made her pause. It wasn't the low, strained voice she had grown used to hearing over the past few days. It was clear, controlled, almost relaxed. She stopped just short of the door, her attention sharpening without effort. Then she heard him speak again, and this time there was no mistaking it. His tone carried a warmth that hadn't been there before, directed at someone else. Brenda shifted slightly, just enough to see inside, without making a sound. A woman stood beside the bed, holding a bouquet of flowers, her posture confident, her expression soft, in a way that suggested familiarity. Eric was looking at her with complete focus, his hand reaching toward hers without hesitation. "You made it," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come." The woman smiled, stepping closer, placing the flowers down before taking his hand as if it belonged there. "I told you I would," she replied, her tone calm, almost reassuring. "You just need to get through this." Brenda remained still, her fingers tightening around the cup, her breathing slowing as her body reacted before her mind could process anything clearly. Eric's next words came without pause, and the shift in his voice was unmistakable. "Once I'm out of here, everything will be easier," he said, his gaze fixed on the woman in front of him. "I've already set things up. She doesn't know anything." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him with interest. "And you're sure?" she asked. "She trusts you that much." He gave a small, confident nod. "She's never questioned me," he replied. "All the accounts, the business access, everything is within reach. I just needed time." The woman let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "So the plan hasn't changed," she said. "You recover, you take control, and then you leave." Eric didn't hesitate. "That was always the plan," he answered. "I didn't marry her for anything else." The words landed with a weight that seemed to press against the air itself. Brenda didn't move, didn't react outwardly, but something inside her shifted in a way she couldn't undo. The woman stepped even closer, her voice lowering slightly. "And after that?" she asked. "What happens when it's all yours?" Eric's expression softened in a way Brenda had never seen directed at her. "Then I don't have to pretend anymore," he said. "We won't have to hide." The woman's smile widened, satisfied, as if the answer confirmed everything she needed. Brenda's grip loosened just enough for the cup to slip from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull sound that echoed more loudly than it should have. In the silence of the hallway, neither of them seemed to notice. Inside the room, the conversation continued uninterrupted, as if nothing outside of it existed. Brenda stepped back slowly, her movements controlled, her expression unchanged despite the pressure building beneath the surface. She turned away without making a sound, her steps steady as she walked down the hallway, leaving the door exactly as it was, slightly open, the voices behind it fading with each step she took. Instead of turning back toward that room, she walked in the opposite direction. Brenda moved past the waiting area and out toward the hospital garden, her pace steady, her expression composed in a way that did not reflect the pressure building beneath it. The air outside felt cooler, quieter, removed from everything happening inside. And she sat down on a bench without looking around, her hands resting still as her thoughts began to settle into something sharper than emotion. There was no confusion anymore. No need to question what she had heard or try to reinterpret it into something less damaging. The clarity came quickly, cutting through everything she had believed before, replacing it with a single understanding that did not change no matter how she looked at it. She stayed there longer than she expected, not breaking down, not reacting in any visible way, just allowing her breathing to return to a steady rhythm, while her mind shifted from shock into calculation. When she stood up again, the hesitation that had followed her through the past few days was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that guided her next steps without doubt. Brenda walked back inside with the same controlled pace, her face neutral, her voice steady when she entered the room again, continuing everything as if nothing had changed. She adjusted the blanket, checked the monitors without asking questions, and responded to Eric when he spoke with the same calm tone she had used before, giving nothing away. Over the next several days, her actions remained consistent on the surface, but her focus had moved elsewhere, directed toward details she had previously trusted without review. During the hours when Eric rested or was attended by medical staff, Brenda stepped away briefly, not to clear her head, but to make calls she had delayed for years. The first call was to Thomas Reed, an attorney she had worked with once when she expanded her business, someone who understood contracts, ownership structures, and the legal boundaries that defined control. When he answered, she kept her voice measured, explaining only that she needed a full review of her assets, her business accounts, and any documents that involved shared access. He did not ask unnecessary questions, only requested that she send over everything she had and come by his office when possible. Brenda spent the next hours gathering information, accessing records through her phone, identifying accounts, permissions, and authorizations that had been set up over time, without her paying close attention to their implication. The pattern became clear as she reviewed each detail, showing how much access Eric had been given, how many areas of her business he could reach without restriction, and how easily that could have been used against her if she had continued to trust without verification. Viz. Nassipation. Thomas responded quickly once he reviewed the documents, outlining the steps required to secure everything under her sole control, explaining what could be changed immediately and what would require formal action. Brenda followed each instruction carefully, authorizing updates, removing shared permissions, and initiating changes that re-established her position as the primary owner of everything she had built. The process moved faster than she expected, not because it was simple, but because the legal structure had always been in her favor, something Eric had either misunderstood or assumed would never be questioned. By the time she returned fully to her routine at the hospital, the foundation of her life had already begun to shift back into place, quietly, without any visible sign that anything had changed at all. By the time Eric was discharged, the house no longer felt the same. Brenda drove him home without saying much, keeping her attention on the road while he leaned back in the passenger seat, appearing relaxed in a way that didn't match the situation he had just come out of. Once inside, she helped him settle into the bedroom, adjusting small things out of habit, making sure he was comfortable, moving through each task with quiet efficiency that gave nothing away. Over the next several days, his recovery continued at a steady pace, his strength returning quickly, his movements becoming more confident, and with that change came a shift in his behavior that was subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it became consistent. He spent more time on his phone, often turning the screen away when she entered the room, responding to messages with a focus that didn't include her. His conversations became shorter, less engaged, as if his attention was already somewhere else, and the small details that once connected them began to disappear without explanation. Brenda noticed everything. Every glance, every pause, every change in tone, but she didn't question any of it, choosing instead to respond in the same calm manner she had maintained since leaving the hospital. She continued her routine, preparing meals, checking on him when necessary, keeping the environment stable while her real attention remained fixed on the work she had already set in motion. During the hours, during when Eric rested or stepped outside for short walks, Brenda reviewed updates from her accounts, confirming that access had been restricted, that permissions had been removed, that control had been fully re-established under her name. Each confirmation reinforced the same conclusion, that everything he had assumed was already his remained firmly out of reach. Eric, unaware of any change, carried himself with increasing confidence, occasionally mentioning plans in vague terms, speaking about returning to work, about handling business matters, about taking on responsibilities he believed were still available to him. Brenda listened without reacting, giving neutral responses that neither encouraged nor challenged what he said, allowing him to continue under the impression that nothing had shifted. As the days passed, the distance between them became more visible, no longer hidden beneath concern or necessity, but existing openly in the way they moved around each other, in the lack of shared conversation, in the absence of anything that resembled the connection they once had. One evening, he stepped outside for longer than usual, returning with a different energy, more certain, more composed, as if a decision had already been made. Brenda observed the change without comment, recognizing the pattern for what it was without needing confirmation. From that point forward, his actions aligned with a direction that no longer included her, and he made no effort to hide it. He took calls in separate rooms, lowered his voice when speaking, and began to organize his time in ways that suggested preparation rather than recovery. Brenda continued exactly as she had before, her tone steady, her presence consistent, maintaining the same outward role while internally measuring each step against what she had already secured. There was no urgency left in her movements, no uncertainty in her decisions, only a controlled awareness of timing that guided her without hesitation. By the end of the week, everything that needed to be in place was already done, leaving nothing exposed, nothing accessible, nothing left for him to reach. Eric moved through the house as if it still belonged to him, unaware that the foundation beneath him had already shifted beyond his control, while Brenda remained composed, watching the situation unfold exactly as expected without needing to intervene. One evening, the doorbell rang later than usual. Brenda walked toward the door without hesitation, her steps even, her expression unchanged as she reached for the handle and pulled it open. Eric stood there, fully dressed, his posture upright, his confidence returned, and beside him was the same woman from the hospital, standing close enough to make her position clear without saying a word. This time, there was no attempt to hide anything. Brenda stepped aside calmly, allowing them to enter, her gaze steady as they moved past her into the living room, as if they already belonged there. Eric stopped near the center of the room, taking a slow breath before turning to face her. His tone measured, almost rehearsed. He began speaking without delay, explaining that he had tried to make things work, that he had fulfilled his responsibilities, that he had provided stability, but what was missing had never changed. His words were structured, controlled, designed to sound reasonable, but they carried no weight beyond their delivery. He then shifted his attention toward the woman beside him, his expression softening in a way that made his intentions unmistakable, stating clearly that his feelings were elsewhere and had been for some time. Brenda listened without interruption, her posture relaxed, her hands resting loosely at her sides, giving him the space to finish without reacting. When he finally stated that he wanted a divorce, expecting resistance, expecting questions, expecting some form of emotional response, she answered with a calm acknowledgement that did not match what he anticipated. She walked toward the table, picked up a folder that had been prepared in advance, and placed it in front of him with precise movement. Eric looked down, his confidence shifting slightly as he opened it, his eyes scanning the documents with increasing uncertainty. The filing had already been completed, the process initiated without his involvement, the outcome legally recognized. Before he could speak, Brenda addressed him directly, her voice steady, informing him that there was nothing left to discuss, nothing left to negotiate, and nothing left for him to claim. She outlined the changes that had already taken place, explaining that all financial access had been removed, that every account, every asset, every part of the business structure was now fully secured under her control, leaving no room for interference. Eric's expression changed as the realization settled in, his earlier certainty replaced by visible confusion, followed by a growing sense of instability he could not mask. He attempted to respond, questioning the validity of what he was reading, but the documents in his hands provided clear answers that required no explanation. The woman beside him remained silent at first, watching closely, her attention shifting between him and the papers, until the implications became clear. When she understood that the position he had presented to her no longer existed, her demeanor changed immediately, her distance from him increasing without hesitation. She asked him directly if any of it was still under his control. And when he failed to provide a response that matched what he had promised, her reaction was swift and final. She stepped back, her tone cold, making it clear that her interest had always been tied to what he claimed to have, not to who he was. Without further discussion, she turned and walked out, leaving him standing alone in a situation he had not prepared for. Eric remained there, his posture no longer steady, his control completely gone. Facing a reality that had shifted beyond his reach, Brenda did not raise her voice, did not move toward him, did not offer anything beyond a single, quiet instruction that ended the moment. He left without resistance, the outcome already decided long before he arrived. The house returned to silence, unchanged in appearance, but entirely different in meaning. Brenda stood there for a moment, not in victory, not in relief, but in a clear understanding of what had taken place and what it required to reach that point. She did not look back, did not reconsider, and did not attempt to repair anything that had already been broken beyond recognition. For her, the situation was not about loss or gain, but about clarity, about recognizing that trust without awareness creates openings that cannot be ignored, and that strength is not found in holding on to something that was never real, but in having the discipline to let it end without hesitation.